Here for me, I see the participant window, but no chat.
Okay, Randy can see chat. I can't see participants or chat. That's unique.
I see both. But
Okay. Okay. Folks, if I reloaded, it may drop the participations. We have 11 folks, according to there, but I don't see anything to tell who's there. Jeff and Kayer, can someone monitor that, or shall I try to restart this?
Are you currently in presentation view?
Yes, I am. I can switch to gallery and see if it changes, but I'm in presentation view as the main presenter.
So not to worry, I'll monitor it.
Okay, we'll give it, I have 9 more seconds. Shall we give it 5 after today to see if we get any more, or shall we start promptly?
I would suggest a few additional minutes.
Okay, let me do a countdown then, see if I can get a 5-minute countdown going, and we'll start then. You see the countdown scheme, or is that just for me?
We all get to see it.
Oh, goody. Okay. G will not be here to take notes, folks. So if anyone can take notes, otherwise, I believe this is automatically recorded. At least it's got the red button for recording going. Okay, well, that's exciting. You'll have to handle that till I figure out why this time the I can't see you in the chat window or even detach a chat. Can you tell me if you're there, Donald? You're going to have to speak it since I can't see it.
Yes.
Or chat me.
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Good. Thank you, Donald.
Okay. Yeah.
If there's any way to figure this one out, I have not figured. Any hints from people who are more experienced in this than I am? What might be wrong?
it's working for me, Firefox on a Mac.
Yeah,
I
don't know if I'm clear what the problem you're experiencing is.
I'm not able to see the participants list or anyone trying. I can see the chat, but I can't see the participants list.
So slightly to the right of the chat, directly under the microphone, there should be a thing that has the number 21 next to it. Have you clicked on that?
Yes, and all I see is chairs and participants. Nothing more.
That's what we get.
It tells
if you want to
me
see the
I
chat,
can.
yeah. If you want the chat, you have to flip over to the chat tab.
I can see the chat. I just can't see who's participating.
Maybe if you disconnect and reconnect. Have you tried
If
turning it off and on again?
Well, I think what I'll do is trust my okay. I think I'm going to trust my co-chairs to tell me who's needs to talk. Is that the right way, guys? Or I can disconnect and reconnect?
Go ahead and run the slides. I'll watch for people raising their hands and asking for the microphone. The new Kodi MD replacement seems to be a little bit fussy. You may need to sign in and refresh your window to get that, but it does seem to be working.
Okay.
I see your slides.
Folks, life is good. I refreshed, life worked wonderfully. Browser moment. Okay. Folks, I won't be able to run the slides and create the minutes. So if we'd love to have a minutes taker, Donald, if you get a chance, at least taking notes on our setup presentation would be good. I believe this is recording. Jeff, does that look like we're recording?
It claims to be recording, yes.
Okay, so I'll just go ahead and start with the chair slides. Folks, this is the note well. Enjoy, read. I think most everyone has seen the note well beforehand. This is an IETF interim for IDR. Okay, this is a discussion interim on Flowspec. I sent out several preliminary drafts. If you want, it's in a PDF form. As my co-author and I were discussing it even yesterday. I appreciate all the feedback people have sent to me. I will publish a -03 this week. If you would like a PDF, please, you'll find it in the minutes, under the presentation information in a PDF form. PDF form means I can show you specific pieces. Waymo will present draft Lee IDR Flowspec SRv6, and we're just going to discuss basically the issues. The TLV encodings are are not the most difficult thing in this presentation. The real difficult thing is, have we perceived the problem from the operators? Have we identified the right solution? Jeff sent out several drafts this last year that were extensions of Flowspec V1. Everyone desired a Flowspec V2. I have taken a pass at trying to collect the information and put it in a specification that we've talked about. Donald has been kind enough. Donald is one of my favorite co-authors because he fixes usually all the problems I have. If there's a problem left, it's because I put it there, not because Donald didn't fix it. Okay, so here's again focus Flowspec V2. We have the discussion that we're working on today shows you the basic encodings, the basic concepts. We won't really go through the encodings. We're just going to go through what's in them. You can see the specifics of the encoding in the draft. Again, see the PDF on this presentation, and Wayman will present the one draft. What do we need input on? Look, what Jeff and Kayer and several people have told me is that there are some significant operator problems with expanding Flowspec V1. FSV1 is Flowspec V1. And we need to determine if we've gotten through all the problems. I'm sure we can argue on the encoding, or people who are working on the encoding as an implementation will also tell us. What I have not included is all drafts that use Flowspec V2 that have not been approved. What's also not there is the tunnel drafts. That's the next level of complexity, but I want to stay with the base problem. And then the next step is we're moving toward Flowspec V2 because we've had a lot of discussion. We finally got through the RFCs. And so after you see this, if you think we've covered most of the issues, we'll start to argue whether the draft is ready for the adoption call. If we need more example drafts, let us know. We may allow more drafts on the 1018 interim. We're moving quickly because we understand there are operator issues that are not being solved with Flowspec V1. Any questions on the focus? And co-chairs Jeff and Kayer, did I make any mistakes on this?
I think you've hit.
Have I hit all the issues? Oh, goody. My presentation thing wandered away into the netherworld again. So folks, Jeff, anyone, I can see the chat now and not the others.
I was just going to jump in and say you have summarized it well.
Okay, thank you, Kayer.
Sue, we can see your slides, but you're no longer speaking.
How about now, folks? Let me try again. This is
We
the
can hear you.
Flowspec presentation with Donald and I having the authorship. There is all sorts of, Donald and I could probably be considered editors, as this work has gone on in the working group for a while. Okay, so let's look at Flowspec V2. What does it require? It requires 2 new SAFEs because we've agreed in previous things that we'll add 2 new, that it'll be a ships in the night approach, that we'll have Flowspec V2 and then we'll have Flowspec V1. So it will require 2 new SAFEs and 1 new open capability. The Flowspec components will inherit. In other words, we'll try to keep the Flowspec V1 component definitions the same where we can and allow new Flowspec V2 components. The Flowspec V2 components are useful because that'll allow people to add it with the definitive TLV format. Another change is Flowspec V2 will allow an action chain, that is, an actions ordered by number. We'll have to redefine the Flowspec V1 actions. And what everyone has wanted is the match rules and actions need to be ordered. In Flowspec V1, they were ordered by default. In Flowspec V2, they are ordered by user ordering. So you can say, number 1, please put these matches. And for this match, if something happens, here's the action, and here are the orders of the action. Why do we want to go through this? Because one of the problems we've heard is that deterministic ordering is a problem in Flowspec V1. Much as the defined ordering works in many cases, there are some that it is not well suited for. These cases where it is not well suited is perhaps best described as firewall cases or advanced denial of service. So when it's user ordered, you can say do match 1, then do match 3, then do match 4. If the user ordering, we'll call that UD order, it matches, then we'll order by Flowspec components. Components will have a number from 1 to n. If the user-defined order and the Flowspec components are the same, then we'll match by values. This is simply an extension of the Flowspec V1 concept. Now, we're going to go through in a little bit how you can do Flowspec 1 and Flowspec V2 in the same box. Remember, for IDR, when you use a different SAFI and have AFI-SAFI pairs, then there's ships in the night. And what's the other major change? When the action chain need to be ordered, you can define your user order. So first I want to sample, then I want to redirect the traffic to this particular place, and then I want to limit or turn off the traffic that I might carry. These are actions. Now again, user-defined action has an ordering that's definitive. If the user order is the same, then test the action type and order by number. If the user order and the action type same, then by value, and that's where the actions have to define it. So folks, this is a very simple extension based on many of Jeff's ordering concepts. We're using new AFI-SAFIs, so this is uniquely defined. We're creating definitive orderings because that was another issue. Any comments on questions on the basic capabilities before I go to the next slide? I'm going to explain these, but if you have a question, please, this is a discussion one, so let me know. I'm not seeing any, but I can see the chat room and the mic queue. So I see no one. I'm going on from there. Now, let's look at how you might store your Flowspec device. Let's say you have rules and rule 0 is unique. So I'll come back to that. But for most rules, you'll have a rule, an order. I've left the potential of an ID for network management ease, match components, and rule actions that are chain. And again, I've left a chain ID. These IDs can either be the best of all worlds or the worst of all worlds if people try to utilize them. They're simply added as an identifier that may help you provide an ID basis. Okay, match conditions. The match conditions are pretty much what you'd expect where you're ordering the components via Flowspec V1 rules expanded into Flowspec V2. The rule actions are, again, either user order and chain. So if you have an action, you would say, okay, these actions go to this user order, and then you might say some others. The actions will be ordered in the user fashion. Now, there's one other interesting piece. In order to provide a definitive base, there is a rule 0 that matches 0/0 and permits all. And as you recall from Flowspec V1, every rule that adds to that restricts. Now, I realize that permit all is the general concept of letting a prefix that IDR sends to go through. Some people may want their Flowspec rules to have a different definitive. I need to see examples to see why that couldn't break, but I've put rule 0 with the concept that you could configure it. But I warn you that this is Flowspec is advanced BGP is the best way we can describe it, because you're now limiting the traffic. One of the biggest things that we have to discuss today is what happens if you do not have complete complete information. The filter DB rule 0 permit all 1 through n Flowspec filters. BGP peers with Flowspec 1 and Flowspec 2 in their database of filters need to consider ordering. So if you have Flowspec V1, you're great. If you have Flowspec V2 only, you're great. If you should use a peer V2, which has both of those, there's a recommendation in here that you order your filters with order-based filters first, followed by non-order based filters. So Flowspec V1 goes 1 to n, and then your filters for Flowspec V1 are placed above that. Why? That allows us to deploy all the filters for Flowspec V2 and all their actions, and then pick up the ones that are on Flowspec V1. Again, if you have either one, it won't matter, but if you're ordering your filters, it's assumed if you're in a BGP peer with V1 and V2, you will want those order filters first. If you only have V1 filters, it won't matter. It'll be ordered in the same way. Now let's go to this a simple diagram that will describe many of our problems. If you look, here is a BGP peer, and it could be a peer within a single AS, or it could be a peer within multiple ASs. Assume for, multiple ASs that might be within an AS confederation is probably the best example. The ships in the night send the databases for V2 and V1 separately. So you see the DB V1 in yellow and the DB V2. Peer A and Peer E send both Flowspec V1 and V2. Peer B sends only Flowspec V1. Peer C sends only Flowspec V2, and Peer D sends no Flowspec. Due to ships in the night, this shouldn't be a problem. Everyone is agreeing with the AFI-SAFI. However, how do you keep the forwarding tables working well? Again, that is part of our concern that we've gotten it correctly. By ordering them first DB2, then DB1, we believe that most of it'll have the right restriction of flow traffic. But you see over here in our friend Peer D, does Peer D's data flow really match? And those are the questions about deployment. In this, many people have deployed Flowspec targeted. They either send it via route reflectors and have an overall AS description, or they send it to targeted nodes. And if it was a targeted node, maybe Peer D is not really targeted. We'll come back to this discussion because that's part of it. Okay, a little bit more on action changes with user-defined ordering. Again, action 0 default is defined as permit all or do all the actions. Then you have user-defined ordering. All the actions, by the way, when you have user-defined ordering in a chain and you say permit all, it simply means if you have no action, you are the same as filters with everything. You're allowing everything to transmit. Once you have a user-defined action, that takes place. The user-defined order. The ordering will be user-defined order and then action type and then action value, where the actions must define the value. For example, if you're actually limiting traffic by packets, it will be first the AS that specifies it and then the value. The reason is we're assuming the users will order it based on what they want, and this tie breaking based on action type and then value is simply a failure for some of the deployment to work correctly. However, with the defined actions, hopefully life is deterministic. It does this and then it does this. Now, one of the things we have to consider is what happens when actions fail to complete. Both Jeff, I, and many people have worked, Randy, and many people on the list have worked on network management, which has a reply response. And one of the key problems that NetConf RESTConf had is what happens when actions fail to complete? How do you characterize it? Well, that's one of the major issues. What do? Do you continue on? Best effort, make the actions you can. Do you stop? Do you use a conditional point? I'll continue. This type of things, we need to talk about what's necessary. Simple is if you don't if you have a failure, you simply stop. Does that mean you stop and roll back? That's another thing that the NetConf people did. Right now, it's defined as hit a failure, stop. That's a failure to complete the action. For example, if you were to sample something and you had a failure in sampling, would that failure in sample prevent you from limiting the traffic or redirecting the traffic? That's something we need to talk about. Okay, now there's some other issues that we have regarding the tight binding of the actions with a particular match. For example, if you have a match and you have a community associated with it, wide or extended, you may strip those communities at the edge of the AS. No harm done, stick on a new communities. And we anticipate that's the way that most of this will happen. However, the original precept was operational issues regarding denial of service, where you might have the die internet worm concept. Does that mean we should bind certain filters to a die internet worm type of actions and never let them be moved aside? Jeff and I, in making this discussion, said that though that sounds like a good proposal, the operational issues in actually taking the die internet worm type action and moving it from one domain to another may be problematic. So I'm just listing that as an issue. I can remove the action encoded in the NLRI simply by one quick swipe of a pen, and that might be the right thing. Believe I've gone through the action items. Are there any questions about the die internet worm NLRI binding?
So Warren has a comment in chat. His comment is, surely the correct behavior and failure depends on the purpose. I'd be sad if the default is to apply none and my interface is now wide open. I'd equally be sad if it applies to some, but my interface doesn't let me log in. Warren, did you care to comment further on that?
That about sums it up, right? Like certain things failing closed is the right answer. Certain things failing open is the right answer. I think what many people do is they apply, a set of policies and then layer this on top. So maybe that's not the end of the world, but it does still seem like the correct failure is very much dependent on if it's acting as a firewall or a sampler or a, let's log some stuff, or what the purpose of the policy being applied is.
And the text inside says this could be changed per configuration, because I do agree with that. The action 0 is to provide some deterministic fashion in case no actions are applied to a filter. So hopefully there would be some default if you matched a filter than something you were filtering and wanting, if you got a filter, hopefully you would have some default actions for all of your filters.
Right, and if I could interject, one of the things that possibly does not belong in the protocol text, Warren, but might actually be good operational text, is if you want something like, here's the rule that allows you to make sure that you can still SSH into all of your routers. You want that thing to obviously be a higher precedence rule than most of the stuff flying through Flowspec. That's probably something that either needs to go as something local inside of your firewall configuration that Flowspec is ordered afterwards, or if not, you could certainly put it into Flowspec itself, and the user-defined ordering can let you do that.
See, this is one of the challenges, is to go beyond the defaults you find in Flowspec V1. As Jeff tried to unpack a simple addition to V1 and V2, the feedback we were getting is that doesn't give me enough flexibility to solve some of the problems. Okay, this specification gives you flexibility, but you're gonna have to define use cases for operators, because this isn't something you're going to, as far as I can see, is just hand to a implementation team and say, give me one that works in all networks. Just not going to happen. You will probably be able to define various scenarios for different networks. And I was hoping we'd get some feedback from operators to see if the assumption I just made is true. And if it is true that you want to tailor this, then it would be good to have a few use cases. This is one where the use case of Flowspec may be very, very important.
So Warren has his hands raised. Warren, you have the cue.
That Jeff kind of covered a fair bit of it. I think along with this, there needs to be operational discussions. And I mean, I know what some vendors allow you to do is have basically tag of like, permit this, some special tag which says Flowspec stuff fits in here. And then either that's the end of the chain, or, you can continue it further on. But that's implementation detail, but probably worth having some operational note, that a way to have the Flowspec stuff sort of append or modify or extend, whatever you want to call it, the policy/rules is probably good. But I think Jeff already covered much of that.
Yep. Jeff had hoped Nanog and some of the other operator forums might open up again for live discussions. I'm not sure when COVID's going to let that happen, but we really do need the operator feedback before this gets out in the wild. And again, this is just going through the action chain, must plan for failure. And I think we've covered that already. Any questions on why actions must plan for failure?
So just to pass along some of the other discussion that we've had amongst ourselves with the chairs, the headache here is partially touching on a topic that's very lightly discussed in the remainder of the presentation and is really deserving of a lot more discussion later on, of how do we handle issues from incremental deployments. So with the match conditions that Sue's shown and the action conditions that she's discussing right now, the headache we have is what happens if things fail to install, not only just from a problem with the way the rules are architected, but perhaps a feature is being requested that simply is not supported on the local box. And as Warren sort of points out, you want to make sure that your intent across the network for your filtering gets respected. But if it's not possible to actually implement that intent, you need to do something sane. And that's a combination of one part just figuring out how the incremental intent would or not get applied based on a support or lack of support for a given feature, and making sure that your rule ordering is designed so that if you do have some sort of failure, that your network fails open or closed appropriately.
And one other thing that we have been discussing is IDR is a distribution protocol. And I'll pick this up in a couple moments, but it's a great distribution protocol to send LRI and to send these rules out quickly. However, it is not a reply protocol. You send things out and they get installed. But that's it. If you have a failure with the action, the only thing that you can find out that records that is some sort of network management thing, either a message back via netconf, restconf, log. With a Yang module, you might be able to have something where you send an action that says, if I get any of these, please send me back. And the push and the recording piece in netconf now allows that to work with lots of filters. The push-pull type work there has been good, but that's not going to come from BGP. So let's say you've got a die internet worm and you want to know when it gets installed. The place that that's going to work from is not from BGP. That action response is not in the scaling of BGP. That action response, however, could scale very well in a network management. There it is. I didn't turn to the next page. So when BGP delivers LRIs in communities with good scaling properties, you're doing great. You've got a quick multicast or a good web burst. Action response for netconf restconf was built into the monitoring. They've done a lot of work and a lot of testing to see that you can filter this out at a particular place. If this is coming in, we may want to finish up our BGP MIB module and quickly add a Flowspec portion that provides this type of burst return. I do not see where you're going to be able to instrument this purely from BGP, but these filters in netconf really have a good massive bursts. Okay, folks, these are the drafts I've considered. For the components, I've discovered the V1 plus the SRv6 you're going to hear, and the L2 VPN, which is approved, and wonder of wonders, SFC has produced an RFC with a Flowspec. You can thank Adrian for that. There is another AFI-SAFI coming out of the Flowspec NVO3, which turned into the NVO3 layered tunnel stuff, but I decided, and Donald, based on Donald's good recommendation, that we should leave that for a second round, get our basics working. And then I've taken actions out of a number of places. I believe that the other IDs that are on process either provide me new filters or new actions and that they will be easy to add, but we need to sort of get some agreement on the things that are either in IDR's basic. Now, there is one worthy of these action bases that's worthy of a separate comment. And that's the IDR Flowspec Interface Set, which says, okay, these actions only go to this interface set. And that may have some ordering constraint, in which case my decision at this point in the draft was to say that's an action specific, and people who deploy should realize that might want to be first or might want to be carefully user ordered. But that the best case for that is for the people who originally defined it to help us define both the good use of it and to not constrain the actual base draft. Jeff, I'm not sure I've captured everything from our chair's discussion on draft IDR Flowspec Interface Set. Is there anything you'd like to add there?
Sure. Then this hits some of the metas that aren't necessarily covered in the presentation. So you discussed this sort of lightly in the context of actions, and the current encoding that's discussed inside of the draft version 3 of the Flowspec V2 is, what do you do about your actions? Are they part of the NLRI? And that's what's suggested in the document. And you already had discussed maybe these things belong in the NLRI, and maybe these things belong as a separate thing, similar to what we have today. The fundamental issue that we have with tucking things with NLRI is you don't really get a chance on a hop-by-hop basis, or even at a ASBR, as an example, to be able to change things. So in circumstances where you're expecting to need to alter something for some reason as you pass stuff either router to router or across the AS boundaries, you have to decide where the stuff lives. If it's in the NLRI, it's sort of stuck there and it's not easy to change it. And we have long experience that tells us that trying to change BGP routes from one format to another on a router basis without crossing the AFI-SAFI boundary is a recipe for all sorts of interesting headaches. So what this suggests in a lot of circumstances is if you're expecting mutable properties for whatever reason, they probably belong as something like a path attribute. If you want them to be immutable, they're pretty much stuck there forever. So for interface set as a specific example, it's really a match criteria, and the vast majority of the match criteria currently live in the NLRI. The problem is that an interface set is a given operator's idea of what a domain assignment looks like for your interfaces. So if number 100 matches your peers, number 200 matches your customers in some domain, and that changes in a different domain, either the circumstance where you're passing a customer to service provider filter in Flowspec, or from a service provider to a peer service provider filter, and needs to change, it probably can't live inside of the NLRI. And we see a little bit of this discussion happening as well as part of like the BGP card discussion about how it's structuring its NLRI. Hit two things in chat. So Linda is asking about draft DMC IDR, and that just didn't make the list, Linda. So please, if you have considerations that apply to Flowspec V2, make sure that goes to the list. Randy Bush writes, if two-way signaling is actually important, perhaps a send-only signaling mechanism is suboptimal.
I agree. If two-way signaling is actually important, then a send-only signaling is not going to scale. If you think that you can do send one, respond with another, go ahead. Just be clear what we're doing.
And to add color from prior chair chat on this, we know that BGP is a open control protocol, and it's not intended to have a full feedback loop built into the protocol. One of the discussion points I've had with some producers of software that use Flowspec, for example, Arbor Networks, there is a need to have some level of information coming back from Flowspec, whether it's simply what rules are installed in a routing table syntax, but also the filtering context as well. And even ignoring the Flowspec V2 work itself, there is a use for some sort of management feedback, which these days would probably be a flavor of streaming telemetry for this stuff. The interesting question becomes, is this a required part of the mechanism to get more complicated filtering deployed? I think that's an open question.
And in lies our real concern. You don't want to make it, I don't want to put in an action response protocol into BGP because there are other ways to do that. And action responses tend to change scaling properties is the best way to kindly put it. Okay, I think we've covered many of these, but I will go through the issues I see we need to have some good discussion on, just so that as a summary on some of the things Jeff and I have said. This may be your first time looking at this. We're gonna, if you have to go away and think about this, if you just let the chairs know so that we know, okay, this was a lot to drink the first time, we'll bring it up again. We're just picking up this Flowspec V2 work after we've gotten the V1 RFCs out. So the Flowspec V2 actions that we need to discuss are what happens if an action fails in the chain. How are new actions deployed? And I've got some diagrams to discuss how that happens. What happens if you have new actions and you fail in the new actions, and will that create an inconsistent environment? What about filters? How should nodes handle unknown filter components if you're just going with V2? Because part of V2 is the ability to say, okay, I've got a certain set of filters now, and if you implement the V2 spec, I've given you the filters from the past and the ones we've agreed on as IDR, and we'll get a deployment of those filters and we'll send it forward to RFC. But then there's going to be new filters because there'll be new worms, there'll be new technology. How do we handle them? What happens if you have Flowspec V2 and you get a new filter component? Should we be sending out capabilities? Jeff gave you a proposal for that, and people a proposal for that for V1, and people roundly said, no, I didn't really want to do that. So how should we do it? Do we send out a profile? Do we not send out a profile? Do we just ignore filter components we don't know? That's a real issue we haven't really talked about. And I will go through in some topologies, and we'll try to talk through that in a moment. Right now, we've given you our view of the Flowspec V2 and V1 nodes. Ships in the night transmission filters need deterministic order. Why? Because many of the problems we've heard are lack of deterministic order, where one implementation chooses one order and another implementation chooses another order. The protocol should have deterministic. If the implementations that put in that make it non-deterministic can't fix that, that's always possible.
So
What
if I could
issues?
interject on that one point. So Flowspec V1 is deterministic. It's more a matter that the ordering that was chosen for Flowspec V1 determinism was targeted very specifically towards certain DDoS situations. And even for DDoS, sometimes that ordering is not optimal.
That is a good correction, Jeff. Thank you. I'll just say thank you. But you need the determinism for orders to work, for filters to work in an appropriate way. I'm going to be asking or putting my little chair hat out and begging for operational issues and feedback. Flowspec is deployed, and we're going into Flowspec V2 not because it's a really because BGP lacks another technology piece to put into it, but because there are operational issues. So what operational issues have we left out, or are we failing to solve? And then the error handling is another embedded error handling case. And I've tried to write a good validation error handling. Please take a look at the PDF. You can print that. If you have any comments, let me know this week. Next Monday, I will produce the O3. I've gotten lots of terrific feedback. And if you sent me feedback and I didn't, in all the changes, I didn't correctly handle it. Now, here's our discussion point topology. Let's say that we have peer A that is sending out Flowspec V2 features, and peer C that is sending out Flowspec V2 features. And suddenly peer V2 starts to send out, let's pick an SR VSIC filter and a new filter for SVC. And what these filters do is they drop a particular data stream into either the SVC forwarding in a particular point, or they drop things into a SR segment routing sequence. Suddenly traffic is moving out. Now Flowspec V2 over here there's no hand waving, so I guess I'll just have to indicate peer C has dropped these new filters in, and peer E and A receive them, and they have no idea what to do with them. Peer C is sending the traffic down those things as it's installed it, and it thinks it sent it out to peer A and peer E, and they're just looking at them. What should they do? How should we handle that? Should we say, if you don't know them, put the filters in the list? What happens for these implementations? One way that other groups have done is to send out profiles. We could send out profiles for this. Usually in IETF, that's been done in versioning. We could add a minor version inside of the protocol. Is this a scenario? First of all, let's take this questioning kickoff discussion in many ways. Is this a scenario that you can see where you have first filters for DDoS and then you switch over to filters that might put segment routing on one place and put SFC forwarding on another? Is this a really reasonable discussion topology, first of all? Sort of looking for feedback.
So while we're waiting for other people to find their unmute button or raise hand button, the topology here is also a good discussion point for not only the different capabilities, but also where you tend to send your rules. So we gave an excellent example that perhaps some portions of your network support segment routing, and you want to use segment routing features as Flowspec components, either for matching or for sending for your actions. Maybe you have an SFC portion of your network that wants to do this. And where this conversation sort of moves us again back to is the incremental deployment considerations. And this was part of our discussion about could we put most of the missing things that we need, or at least the easy ones, back into Flowspec V1. And the answer people kept on giving is, well, no, we want this in Flowspec V2. What we're sort of seeing here is that it doesn't really change the equation. It's still equally as hard for distribution. We have to figure out what these things still mean, and how do the actions that might be compatible for one portion of your network get passed along or not in another portion.
We're not seeing any we're not seeing anyone rush to the chat window. We can come back to these topologies. We really did want to have all sorts of topology discussions because this is the real challenge with this. I think in order to inspire those, what I'll do is I'll go pick up another presentation from Waymo on an example, okay? And so this is one where you're adding to the Flowspec filters. Waymo, can you grab the mic and
Yes,
go ahead?
can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you.
Good.
So I'll put myself on mute and you should go ahead and just tell me when to advance the slides.
Okay, hello everyone. Today I'm going to present BGP Flowspec for SRv6. Next page. So basically, we originally we defined two component types for SRv6. One is for the whole SRv6 seats, and then another type is for part of seats. So some people, after some discussions in the mailing list, so I think it's iDream1 suggests we may combine those two types into one, so which is one part, because some parts of the seats includes the whole seats. So that's a good suggestion. So in the latest version, we combine original two components into one. So that's one component for SRv6. So this component contains a list of open values, which defines magic conditions on some parts of seats, or combination, or some of combinations of some parts of seats. So because seats have special structures, it contains locator, function, and arguments. So we can define match conditions to match some parts of a seat or some combination parts of the seats. So next page, we give more details. So here we define this component. So this component, at first, we indicated the structures of seats we're going to match. So we indicated a locator length, function length, and argument length. So this indicated the structure of seats we're going to match. And then we will have a list of op and values. So these op values will be the match conditions to some parts of a seat. So basically, those operations is corresponding to the existing one already defined in RFC 8955. So here we just introduce a field type. So this field type will indicate which field or which part of seat we're going to match. So we define here, we give, so 00 field type, if it's 0, indicate the locator part of a seat. 1 is the function part. 010 indicated the arguments part. And then we also give some kind of combinations. So because the combinations should be make sense. So one combination is a locator part and a function part, they're adjacent. So the other combination or type code is 100, which indicates function and argument parts combined. So the last one is we are going to match all the parts, which is whole seat. So this is field type we indicate is a locator, function, and argument. So if the parts of a seat contains all the parts, that is the whole seat. So next page. So here we give an example encodings for a component for SRv6. Basically, we're going to match a seat or package which contains a seat. So locator is we must be this locator. Locator is 48 bits, and then the value is 2001, DB8, and 3. So for any package with destination with these locators, so that will be one of the component or part of the seat. Match this one, this locator, and then in addition to match this locator, we also give another match conditions, which is that for the function part of that seat, the function part of that seat must be in a range from 100 to 300. So in order to define these match conditions, so we just use, so we have a type. Type is a new component type, and then we indicated the structure of the seat. So here is the locator is 30 bits. Locator is 48 bits. So encode in here is 30 in0x format, and then the function length of the function type part, which is 16 bits, and then the rest is argument part is 64 bits. So after this structure indication, and then we define the match conditions for op and value parts. So the first match condition is match the location part, which is given by the value, which is 2001 and 0db8003. So that's the locator value. And then we also have a match condition, which is indicated that the function part of the seat must be greater than 100 and then less than 300. So this is also defined by the op and the value stuff, which is which is similar or same as those defined in RFC 8955. So next page. So here on the Flowspec V2, so this new component can be fit in the Flowspec V2, the latest version, latest version posted by Xu. So basically, in the Flowspec V2, so the structure is that they have lens and then subtail V's. In this subtail P type, they have order is 4 bytes, and the name of this one is 4 bytes, and then type one, which is for header rules. Then there's subtail V's, length of subtail P, and then subtail V's. In this subtail V, which contains a value which is RP and then component. So the new component for SRv6 can just fit here. So this is according to the current encoding of Flowspec V2. So as the Flowspec V2 moving forward, if they change its format or whatever, and then we can also change accordingly to make our document or Flowspec for SRv6 to fit or align with the ongoing changes.
So I'd like to skip over to a couple slides where Waymo actually is providing you the encoding that could go with an NLY, or it could go in the wide communities. The action, that's the action encoding. His field encoding should be fairly standard. So this is his example if you added an action. So I asked Waymo to present this because there's quite a bit of support to add this particular draft to our list of IDR drafts, but this gives you an example of how it might provide the components, and Waymo's done a wonderful job about trying to give the pattern and the destination references for V6. So I want to thank Waymo for going through this. I'm going to swip back to this slide. This gives you one of the driving factors that people seem to think will make sense, the Flowspec V6. Does this help you in your discussion or thoughts on some of the issues? And Waymo, I'm going to flop back to our issues after I ask for questions. Is there any questions for Waymo on his presentation?
So I throw myself into the queue. Karen's behind me. So Waymo, would like to use your presentation as a discussion point about incremental deployment. So you're intending this feature to be used for networks that support SRv6, and it's possible that a BGP network that has SR support may not have SR support across 100% of it. How are you envisioning this Flowspec feature to be incrementally deployed, within portions of the network that do support it and the ones that don't?
Yeah, that's a good question. And also, this is also a general question for the new features or new extensions. So we need to consider the capabilities, right? So with the capabilities, and then we can, for those that do not support, we just don't send those new thing to the peers.
Okay, so you're envisioning that you would want routes that contain these filters to not be sent to devices that don't support it?
Yeah, that's right. I don't know if this fit or satisfy the requirement for the customers. That's also important that we may get some feedback from the customers.
Okay, and
Well,
I'll ask one
that's part of
final.
what we're. Go ahead, Jeff.
Ask one final piece and then turn it back to you, Sue. So Waymo, for this, would you envision in the capability bits feature that I put a draft out for as being a possible answer for that?
Yeah, I think that will be right for now. The capability will be satisfied. I think most of the requirement right now.
Okay, thank you, Sue.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff.
Hey, this is Kev. Can I jump in? Can you guys hear me?
You have the mic.
Yes.
Yep, super. So one comment, Jeff, all questions you asked are the right ones. Maybe I am little off and it's early morning in California, so please bear with me. But I think SRv6 applies on the edge, has necessary function translation, but if you don't understand the function or you don't understand any SRv6 here, then your edges will not simply behave and execute those functions well. And it will treat it as a normal IPv6 address, blah, 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 more details to follow. So I don't know if you need to worry about backwards compatibility. Then again, worrying about backwards compatibility makes sense for the things you don't know that's going to come in future. So I totally agree. Hey, Waymo, a question for you. Does this format take very well into account the CSID and the newer SRv6 enhancements that are being put in place? Or do you need to do fundamentally any
Not
changes?
specifically, but for the CSAT, for the compressed one, I think maybe that's another step, because for compressed one,
That's what I thought. That's why I thought.
that's a very good question.
Okay.
Yeah, for the compressed one, we may need more detailed descriptions, because the compressed one, as that compressed encoding determined, we can add more text to address that one.
Correct. So that's why that's what I thought. But we can take the conversation offline. Thank you.
Yeah. Very good question. Yes, I agree. Yes.
So pending further questions. So to talk to one of the points that Kayer is mentioning, where this feature may be deployed at the edges and may or may not have interactions with normal v6 behavior. Part of the discussion for that again goes back to how do we actually control where the Flowspec routes go. If you recall Sue's example topology diagram, one way to sort of picture that is we effectively have the equivalent of Flowspec flooding domains. And when it's strictly affy-saffys, we know exactly what that looks like. They're effectively distinct planes that are bounded by a point of distribution, based on the affy-saffys that have been negotiated. That's true for every piece of BGP we've had to date. And for the most part, if it's not the standard internet affy-saffys, for the most part, that does define a region of support for a given family. Where we have an interesting headache is that if we were to ignore this being V1, V2 Flowspec for affy-saffy, we're looking at capability graphs effectively. Does this support this match criteria? Does this support this action criteria? One of the things that we have going somewhat in our favor right now in terms of current operational deployment for Flowspec, we tend to see Flowspec deployed at customers in one of two fashions. The first one is a route reflection plane, which may or may not be the same as your existing IP reflection plane. More often than not, it's disjoint from that. And a route reflector takes the job of distributing a controller's Flowspec routes off to all the devices that can receive them and is intended to process them. The second common deployment that we tend to see is targeted BGP sessions, where we have a BGP route sent only from some Flowspec controller to an individual device, and the routes are typically marked with no advertise so they don't go any further. if we do buy into at least some of the idea that the way we want to control distribution is that devices that are intended to implement Flowspec filtering, so not strictly a control plane route reflector, but actual devices that can do the filtering, those have some sort of capabilities that actually say whether or not they can do things. The interesting headache we have is what do you do when you have a deployment that has largely one or more common Flowspec controllers that may want to use one or more incompatible sets of Flowspec filtering mechanisms, either match or action. And that effectively puts us into what a lot of people that do multicast type stuff look at is convex domain problems. If you wanted to have a single route reflector that's responsible for distributing to everything, if that route reflector is capable of talking to every single device that needs to get the filters, then something like the capability bits filter allows you to centrally load the rules and then at that point to distribute them in a easy fashion. If you have some level of route distribution that's intended to go more than one hop, things can be challenging. You need to make sure that the plane for a given feature set is fully connected. Otherwise, you end up with these islands that aren't getting programmed. This isn't necessarily a new problem in BGP, or especially for people who have done multicast deployments in the past, but it does change the way that Flowspec might need to be operated. What I'd like to do at this point is take this set of points and ask, especially the people that have operational experience, what is your thinking about this? How does this impact how you're likely to want to use Flowspec? And given our silence and given the fact that I see at least a couple of operators on the list, if you're simply not comfortable with the thinking at this point and you're still trying to figure it out, if you wouldn't mind just throwing a note in the chat saying that's where you're at, that would also be helpful. We certainly hit the point where nobody seems to be in the chatting mood except for the presenters. I guess the last comment I'd actually want to leave here is that this set of issues isn't necessarily distinct to Flowspec V2. This is the same set of things that if we wanted to keep things on the simpler side of things, was exactly the problem we have with Flowspec V1 and incremental deployment of new features. So V2 does not necessarily make this any better at this point.
If this forum is not a good way to provide us feedback, or if you need some thoughts, the chairs have tried to go toward improving V1 to solve your problems. Here's a Flowspec V2. I've given you some details, but we really need some feedback before going forward to firm ourselves up on a V2 effort, because you had we still have this problem.
Donald, you have the microphone.
Respond very briefly to you. I claim that FSV2 does make things better because the consistent TLV encoding makes it possible to skip over unknown filter conditions and things like that when you want to do that.
Okay, that's a good discussion point. So the original text that we had in Flowspec V1 basically said that if you're not able to implement the full set of a given match criteria, it was largely silent in the action criteria, that if you can't implement it all, you don't install the rule in your forwarding engine. What I think you're trying to say is that in Flowspec V2, we at least get away from the problem that we had in Flowspec V1 of not being able to properly encode things. Now we have at least one discussion point about how we could solve part of that problem. I guess the question becomes, is your thinking that, do we allow some of these filtering criteria to be optional? If so, what do you think that means to the network's forwarding intent?
If you're asking me, I guess I think that it really depends on the particular case and what the default is and stuff like that. So admittedly, in the filter criterion case, it's less clear when it would be useful. It's more useful to be able to have an action in an action set bypassed when the action is unknown or cannot be executed.
Okay, let's actually supply a concrete example, and maybe that would be useful to help with the discussion. So one of the optional features my employer has some people on a draft for is the ability to do payload matching inside of the packets. And we're seeing a slightly different flavor of this, perhaps by different example, on the header that Waymo's showing us for SRv6. If it's the case that you have a Flowspec filter that matches some sets of criteria, for example, an IP destination, maybe like a TCP port, and has an intended action that might be some form of rate limiting. If you have a component that further refined the filter, perhaps matching a piece of payload or potentially matching a portion of your SID, it's probably not the greatest idea in most of those cases to skip over, because what happens if you skip that component, you're effectively matching the stuff in a looser fashion. And there may be cases both for and against that. Maybe you want to say, in the portions of my network that I can understand these things, it's actually great that I'm further restricting how much damage I'm doing to stuff that I'm inspecting. Basically I can look deeper. And it's okay where things can't be inspected at that level to fall back to that criteria. So if it's the case, you may have effectively some level of optionality. Have you given any thought to should that be how should that be signaled in NLRI as an example?
One could signal that in various ways by adding in additional information to the components and so forth, indicating what to do under which sorts of validity conditions, one might say. I think it's good to be able, if it doesn't take up too much space or anything, to be able to encode for all the different possibilities, because it's not clear we can anticipate what all the requirements will be.
Okay, that seems like a reasonable discussion point to take on for the V2 encodings. And we may very well end up in some flavor of some of these things are mandatories and must be supported by everybody. Effectively, the Flowspec V1 components are very widely supported across the majority of implementations, and making those mandatory bitwise, if that's a way of signaling that the NLRI may be one way to carry this forward. And for the optional components, allowing the user to say this component is optional or potentially optional because the fallback has actually been considered in its intent.
That's some input that goes toward your capability bits. Well, folks, is there any other discussion? We had scheduled these interims for discussion. If you want to think, I will probably raise the Flowspec drafts that want to also chime in on this on the October 18th proposal the October 18th time, which has new drafts. We thank you for your participation, and we hope this was a good introduction. The chairs really need some operational feedback to go on from here. So, Jeff or Kay, or anything else you think we should cover today?
I think last thing that might be useful to do a quick poll on is for the people that are attending the interim. What's your opinion about, are we ready to pick this up as an adopted working group item and take the work forward there, or are we still in need of further discussion?
Show of hands.
Let me do the show of hands tool. So I'm going to do the show of hands tool. Option now or more work. If you think it's option now, raise your hand. If you think it's not ready to go, don't raise your hand.
You have to click on the show of hands tool at the top to be able to respond.
You have to do it. There's a show of hands tool on the.
It's the bar graph on the user toolbar. While that's going on, Linda, you have the microphone.
Sure. Is it for supporting to be adopted? Is that same show of hand or different? I'm just putting that hand there.
Yes, it's for should we go forward to adoption or get more input.
Okay, I'm just showing for
adoption now.
Yeah.
Send out a query for adoption now.
Yeah. Thank you.
Well, folks, we've got a limited people saying adoption now. I'll give you a few more seconds and then we'll end this. I think we've probably not gotten overwhelming sense there. Give you a couple more seconds and we'll close it and close the interim. Okay, I'll end the poll, Jeff. We have even just 5 responders out of 18, so I think people are not looking for providing responses, or maybe they're looking at 2 interims. Jeff and Kier, anything else we have for today before we close?
From mine, thank you.
Okay.
Nothing further.
Okay. Well, thank you all for joining us, and we'll post a recording of the notes on this later this week. Thank you very all. Bye-bye.
Talk to you soon.